The rifle's report echoed across Pine Valley as Jackson Carter squeezed the trigger. The gray wolf dropped mid-leap. Its attack on the cattle herd ended before it began. Jackson lowered his Winchester, the familiar weight of the rifle an extension of himself after all these years. Dawn had barely broken over the Montana hills, the morning air still crisp with night's chill. He'd been up since 4, tracking the predator that had killed 3 calves in the past week. A man protected what was his. That was the code Jackson had lived by since the war. The scream cut through the morning silence like a blade. Jackson's head snapped toward the sound, high-pitched, desperate, coming from the eastern trail. He squinted against the rising sun and caught movement, a small figure running full tilt down the dirt path, with 3 larger shadows in pursuit. Without hesitation, Jackson whistled for his horse. The chestnut quarter horse responded immediately, trotting to his side. In one fluid motion born from years in the cavalry, Jackson mounted and reached for the Colt Navy .36 holstered at his hip. The revolver had saved his life more times than he could count during the war and after. "Let's ride, Thunder," he muttered, digging his heels in. The horse bolted toward the commotion, eating up ground with powerful strides. As they closed the distance, Jackson could make out a girl, no more than 12, her dress torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Behind her, 3 men on horseback were gaining ground, their intentions clear in the determined set of their shoulders. Jackson cut across their path, Thunder skidding to a halt between the girl and her pursuers. The men reined in hard, dust billowing around their mounts. "This ain't your business, stranger," the lead man growled, hand hovering near his pistol. Jackson's Colt was already drawn, hammer cocked. "It became my business when 3 grown men decided to chase down a child on my land." The girl cowered behind Thunder, her breathing ragged from running. Jackson kept his eyes on the men, rough types, hired muscle by the look of them. "That there's Frank Miller's girl," another man said. "He wants her back." "I ain't going back," the girl shouted, voice breaking. "He'll kill me this time." The leader's hand inched closer to his gun. "Now, mister, you best move aside. Miller pays our wages, and he wants his daughter home. Your wages won't matter much if you're dead," Jackson replied, voice flat and cold as January steel. "And that's exactly where you're headed if those fingers touch your pistol." The standoff stretched for 3 heartbeats. The leader moved first, a fatal mistake. Jackson's Colt barked once, the bullet tearing through the man's shoulder. He screamed, clutching the wound as his horse reared. The other 2 froze, eyes wide with shock at Jackson's speed. "Next one goes between the eyes," Jackson said. "Take your friend and tell Miller if he wants his daughter, he can come talk to me himself." Jackson Carter at the North Valley Ranch. The men glanced at each other, then grabbed their wounded companion and retreated, cursing as they went. Jackson holstered his weapon and turned to the girl, who stared up at him with eyes too old for her young face. "You hurt?" he asked, dismounting. She shook her head, though the bruises on her arms told a different story. "He'll come for me. My pa don't let things go." "What's your name, girl?" Sarah Miller." Jackson nodded. "Well, Sarah Miller, I reckon you need some place safe for now. Can you ride?" She nodded, and he helped her onto Thunder, settling her in front of him before turning toward his cabin. As they rode, he noted the way she flinched at sudden movements, how her small frame seemed to fold in on itself. Signs he recognized from soldiers who'd seen too much battle. Jackson's cabin stood alone against the pines, a fortress of solitude since Elizabeth and their son Thomas had been claimed by the fever 6 years past. The place was Spartan but solid, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a covered porch that overlooked the valley. Inside, Jackson busied himself with coffee, while Sarah perched awkwardly on a chair, eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. When he set a tin cup before her, steam rising from the dark liquid laced with milk and sugar, she stared at it as if it might vanish. "Drink," he said, "then we'll talk." She sipped cautiously, both hands wrapped around the cup. Why'd you help me? You don't even know me. Jackson paused, considering the question. The real answer was complicated, wrapped up in memories of Elizabeth, of Thomas, of the men he'd fought beside, and the promises he'd made. Instead, he offered a simpler truth. Some things a man just knows are right. He settled into the chair across from her, his back to the wall, facing the door out of habit. Now tell me why Frank Miller's daughter is running like the devil himself is on her heels. Sarah's story spilled out between sips of coffee. Frank Miller owned the largest saloon in Pine Creek, a man feared for his temper and reputation with cards and women. Sarah's mother had died 3 years ago, and since then, Miller had grown increasingly bitter and violent. Last night, she said, voice barely a whisper, I asked if I could sit at the table with him and his friends. They were eating steak. Her fingers twisted in her lap. He said I don't belong at the table with men, that I ask too many questions. Then She stopped, swallowing hard. He hit you, Jackson finished for her. She nodded. Said if I was so grown, I could feed myself or starve. I ran when he passed out. But this morning he sent Davy and the others to bring me back. Jackson's jaw tightened. He recognized Miller's type. He'd seen them in the war, men who used their strength to prey on the weak, who confused cruelty with power. Before he could respond, hoofbeats approached from the trail. Sarah tensed, eyes wide with panic. Stay inside, Jackson ordered, reaching for his rifle. He stepped onto the porch just as 5 riders pulled up to his cabin. At their center sat Frank Miller, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and cold eyes that assessed Jackson's property with open disdain. You, Carter? Miller called, not bothering to dismount. I am. And you're trespassing. Miller's lip curled. I hear you shot one of my men and took something that belongs to me. Jackson's grip on the Winchester tightened. Children don't belong to anyone, Miller, even their fathers. That's mighty righteous coming from a gunman. Miller spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Yeah, I know who you are. Jackson Carter, best shot in the 4th Cavalry before you turned hired gun after the war. They say you've killed more men than Winter. Then you know what happens if you try to take the girl by force. Miller's eyes narrowed. She's my blood. The law says she's mine until she's of age. The law also says a man can't beat his child half to death, Jackson countered. Those bruises tell their own story. For a moment, Miller seemed to consider rushing the cabin, his men shifting restlessly in their saddles. But Jackson stood motionless, rifle ready, eyes hard as flint. Even a man like Miller could count the odds. This isn't over, Carter, Miller growled finally. I'll be back with the sheriff and the law on my side. We'll see how you stand then. He wheeled his horse around, barking orders at his men as they retreated down the trail. Jackson watched until they disappeared from sight before lowering his rifle. When he returned inside, Sarah stood in the middle of the room trembling. He'll come back, she said. He always does. Jackson nodded. I expect so, but things will be different this time. Why? Jackson checked the Winchester's action, making sure it was clean and ready. Because this time, you're not alone. Over the next 3 days, Jackson taught Sarah what he could about survival. He showed her how to use a skinning knife, how to read tracks in the soil, and even the basics of handling his old Army Colt. It's heavy, she complained, arms shaking as she aimed at a line of bottles Jackson had set up. It's meant to be, he replied, reminds you that taking a life ain't something to do lightly. Sarah's shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet from the target. She frowned in frustration. Again, Jackson instructed, and remember to breathe. As the sun climbed higher, Sheriff Wallace arrived alone, his weathered face grim beneath his hat. Jackson sent Sarah inside and met the lawman in the yard. You're stirring up a hornet's nest, Jack, Wallace said without preamble. Miller send you? Wallace shook his head. Not officially, but he's been making noise in town, saying you kidnapped his girl. Got Judge Holloway's ear already." Jackson's expression hardened. "You've seen how he treats her, Tom. The girl's got bruises older than the ones I gave his men." "I know it," the sheriff sighed, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "And truth be told, I've looked the other way more than I should have. Miller's got half the town in his pocket, the other half too scared to cross him. And where do you stand?" Wallace replaced his hat, meeting Jackson's gaze directly. "I stand with the law, but sometimes the law and what's right ain't the same thing." He glanced toward the cabin. "You planning to keep her?" "Planning to keep her safe," Jackson corrected. "After that, we'll see." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Miller won't let this rest. Man like him can't abide being crossed. He's gathering men, not just his usual thugs. Word is he's offering $50 a head to anyone who'll ride with him." "Let them come," Jackson said quietly. "I've faced worse odds." Wallace studied him for a long moment. "You always were stubborn, even back in the war. Just be careful, Jack. This isn't Shiloh. These aren't rebels you're fighting." "No," Jackson agreed. "This time, it's something worth fighting for." After the sheriff departed, Jackson spent the afternoon setting up defenses around the property. He dug shallow trenches at strategic points, rigged warning lines, and positioned extra ammunition where he could reach it quickly. Sarah watched him work, her small face solemn. "You don't have to do this," she said as the sun began to set. "I could just go back." Jackson paused, driving a stake into the ground with more force than necessary. "Is that what you want?" "No," she admitted, voice small. "But I don't want you getting killed because of me." Jackson straightened, looking at the girl directly. In just 3 days, she seemed different, standing straighter, eyes clearer. "There are things worth dying for, Sarah, but I don't plan on dying today." The attack came at dawn, just as Jackson had anticipated. The first sign was the tripwire he'd strung across the eastern approach, sending tin cans clattering, an old cavalry trick that had saved his unit more than once. "Get to the back room," he ordered Sarah, who was already awake and dressed. She nodded, pale but composed, taking the loaded pistol he'd prepared for her. Jackson positioned himself at the front window, Winchester ready. He counted at least 10 riders approaching, Miller at the lead with a shotgun cradled in his arms. More men than he'd expected. Miller must have emptied his pockets for this show of force. The first shots came from the tree line, covering fire as 3 men rushed the side of the cabin. Jackson's rifle cracked twice, and 2 men fell. The third dove behind the water trough, pinned down. "Carter!" Miller's voice boomed across the yard. "Send out my daughter, and maybe you walk away from this." Jackson didn't waste breath answering. He moved to another window, fired 3 more shots, then ducked as bullets splintered the wooden frame. The firefight intensified, lead tearing into the cabin walls from multiple directions. Jackson moved methodically, years of combat experience guiding his actions. Shoot, move, shoot again. Never stay in one spot. Sarah appeared at his side with fresh ammunition, her face streaked with tears but her hands steady. "I told you to stay back," he growled, reloading. "You need help," she replied simply. A bullet shattered the window above them, sending glass raining down. Jackson pulled Sarah to the floor, shielding her with his body as wood splinters cut his cheek. "They're coming closer," Sarah whispered. Jackson nodded grimly. "Stay low." He crawled to the front door, peering through a crack. Miller's men had fanned out, using the chaos to advance on the cabin. If they reached the walls, they could burn them out. Making a swift decision, Jackson threw open the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle blazing. The sudden counterattack caught Miller's men by surprise. 2 more fell before they could react, and the others scrambled for cover. Miller himself took a bullet to the leg, cursing violently as he dragged himself behind a fallen tree. Kill him, he roared. 50 more to whoever puts Carter in the ground. The remaining men hesitated, weighing the bounty against the deadly accuracy of Jackson's rifle. It was enough. A momentary pause that allowed Jackson to duck back inside, slam the door, and barricade it. "We've got to move," he told Sarah, bleeding from his temple where a bullet had grazed him. "They'll regroup and rush us next." Sarah's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded, helping him gather ammunition. A new voice called from outside, not Miller's but familiar. "Jack, it's Hayes, don't shoot!" Jackson frowned, moving cautiously to the window. Lucas Hayes had been his sergeant during the war, now the blacksmith in Pine Creek. What was he doing here? "I'm coming in," Hayes shouted. "I'm alone and unarmed." Jackson signaled for Sarah to stay down, then cracked the door, rifle ready. Hayes approached slowly, hands visible, no weapons. "You picked a hell of a time for a visit," Jackson said, letting his old friend inside. Hayes grinned despite the gravity of the situation. "Heard you were hosting a party. Thought I'd join." His expression sobered as he saw Sarah. "This the girl?" Jackson nodded. "Miller wants her back." "So I heard. Half the town's heard." Hayes peered through the window at the men regrouping outside. "You're outgunned." "Jack." "Wouldn't be the first time." Hayes turned back, his face deadly serious. "Miller's bought Judge Holloway. Got him to sign an arrest warrant for kidnapping. Sheriff's being forced to serve it. They're on their way now." Jackson's jaw tightened. "The law's going to stand with a man who beats his child?" "The law stands with whoever pays it," Hayes replied bitterly. "But not everyone in town agrees." He gave Jackson a meaningful look. "Martha Jenkins has been gathering testimonies, folks who've seen Miller's handiwork on the girl over the years. And she's not alone." For the first time since the siege began, Jackson felt a flicker of hope. Martha Jenkins was a force of nature, a widow whose husband had been the town's previous sheriff before Miller's men gunned him down in a robbery. "How long?" Jackson asked. "An hour, maybe less. Wallace is dragging his feet, but he can only stall so much." Jackson considered their options, mentally calculating ammunition, positions, escape routes. "Can you ride?" Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You know I can. What do you need?" "Get to the North Ridge. I've got a cache there, extra rifles, ammunition, and fetch Reverend Tanner if you can find him. If we're going to fight the law, might as well have God on our side." Hayes nodded, then hesitated. "This isn't just about the girl, is it, Jack? This is about Elizabeth and Thomas, too." Jackson stiffened. "This is about what's right." Hayes studied his old friend for a moment, then clasped his shoulder. "I'll be back. Hold them off till then." After Hayes slipped out the back, Jackson reinforced their defenses, acutely aware that the next wave would be more organized. Sarah helped silently, loading spare revolvers and positioning water buckets in case of fire. "Is he your friend?" she asked finally. "That man? Hayes? Yeah. We rode together in the war. Saved each other's lives more times than I can count." Sarah considered this. "I never had a friend before." The simple statement hit Jackson harder than any bullet could have. He looked at the girl, skinny, bruised, but still standing, and felt a surge of righteous anger toward the man who'd broken her spirit. "You've got one now," he told her. The sound of horses announced Miller's reinforcements, the sheriff's party arriving from town. Jackson counted at least 15 men, including Wallace and Judge Holloway, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers who rarely left his comfortable office. "Jackson Carter," Wallace called, his voice pained. "I've got a warrant for your arrest. Come out peaceful-like and bring the Miller girl." Jackson positioned himself at the window, keeping out of sight. "What's the charge, Tom?" "Kidnapping and assault," Wallace replied. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "And what about Miller's charges?" Jackson demanded. "Beating his own child? Sending armed men to hunt her down?" Judge Holloway's reedy voice cut in. Any complaints against Mr. Miller can be addressed in court. Right now, you're harboring his legal dependent against his will. That's a crime, sir. Jackson's laugh was without humor. Mighty convenient how the law works when Miller's gold is in your pocket, Judge. Miller's voice rose above the others. Give me back my daughter, Carter. She's mine by blood and law. Jackson glanced at Sarah, who stood pale but resolute beside the hearth. What do you say, Sarah? You belong to him? She lifted her chin. No, I don't belong to anyone who hurts me. Jackson nodded, turning back to the window. You heard her, Miller. The girl stays. Miller cursed violently. Burn them out. I want Carter dead and my girl alive. Wallace protested, but his voice was drowned out as Miller's men surged forward, torches already lit. Jackson raised his rifle, prepared to sell their lives dearly when a new commotion erupted from the road. A large group of riders appeared, 20 or more, led by a woman on a dappled mare. Martha Jenkins sat straight-backed in her saddle, a shotgun across her lap, her gray hair pulled severely back from a face lined with determination. Behind her rode Hayes, alongside what looked like half the town, the butcher, the school teacher, even old Doc Harris. Judge Holloway! Martha's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. Before you enforce that warrant, I suggest you hear some testimony. The judge spluttered, clearly flustered by this unexpected development. Mrs. Jenkins, this is a legal proceeding. So is this, she interrupted, producing a sheaf of papers. Sworn statements from 12 witnesses to Frank Miller's abuse of his daughter, including Dr. Harris, who treated her broken arm last winter. The one Miller claimed came from falling downstairs. Wallace seized the opportunity, stepping forward. I reckon we ought to hear these witnesses, Judge, seeing as we're all here already. Miller's face contorted with rage. This is ridiculous. She's my daughter. Being a father is more than just siring a child, Jackson called from the cabin doorway, rifle still ready. It's protecting them, teaching them, making them feel like they belong. The standoff stretched taut as wire. Judge Holloway mopped his brow, caught between Miller's fury and the town's unexpected solidarity. Before he could decide, Miller snapped. With a roar of frustration, he drew his revolver and fired at Jackson. The bullet splintered the doorframe as Jackson ducked, then returned fire in one smooth motion. His shot caught Miller in the shoulder of his gun arm, spinning him backward off his horse. The man crashed to the ground, screaming in pain as his weapon fell useless beside him. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sheriff Wallace dismounted, approaching the fallen man cautiously. Frank Miller, he said formally, you're under arrest for attempted murder. He glanced at the gathered witnesses, then added, and on suspicion of child abuse and endangerment. Miller cursed, clutching his bleeding shoulder as Wallace bound his good arm. He'll hang for this, Miller spat, glaring at Jackson. The law works for justice, Wallace interrupted. And today, justice says you're done hurting that girl. As Miller was led away, Martha Jenkins approached the cabin, her weathered face breaking into a rare smile when she saw Sarah. You look stronger already, child, she observed. Sarah nodded shyly. Mr. Carter's been teaching me things. I expect he has. Martha turned to Jackson. The town council will need to appoint a legal guardian. Any suggestions? Jackson hesitated, looking at Sarah. The past week had awakened something in him he'd thought died with Elizabeth and Thomas, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. If she's willing, he said slowly, I'd take the responsibility. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. You want me to stay? For good? This cabin's been too quiet for too long, Jackson replied simply, and you need some place where you belong. 1 year later, Jackson sat at his table as Sarah set out plates for supper. The cabin had changed, expanded with a new room for Sarah, decorated with curtains Martha Jenkins had helped sew, filled with books the school teacher contributed for Sarah's education. Hayes arrived as he did most evenings, bringing news from town. Miller had been sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his saloon sold to cover his debts and legal costs. Sheriff says they might not keep him the full term, Hayes mentioned, accepting the plate Sarah offered. Good behavior and all that. Jackson nodded, unconcerned. When he gets out, he'll find his daughter grown and his power gone. Some men can learn from that. And if he doesn't? Sarah asked quietly. Then he'll find me waiting, Jackson replied. Some things don't change. Hayes raised an eyebrow. What made you do it, Jack? Take in the girl, stand against Miller and half the territory? You had a peaceful life here. Jackson considered the question, watching as Sarah took her place at the table. Not asking permission, not flinching, just belonging. The measure of a man isn't in what he owns, Jackson said finally. It's in what he's willing to protect. What he stands for when standing costs him something. Sarah smiled across the table, no longer the frightened child who had run for her life. And where I belong, she added softly, is right here at this table. Jackson nodded, something long broken inside him finally beginning to heal. That's right, Sarah. That's exactly right.